have Pat Miller, who is going to talk about the weed of the week, which is JohnsonGrass.
JohnsonGrass, some people want to control it and some people want to grow it out in their pastures, and it just kind of depends on who you talk to and what their experiences has been. I've had producers that like it, maybe even plant it and use it a lot, and then I have had some real disasters through my years that I've heard about. So why do we want to control it? To me, it's a risk issue. It can have prussic acid or nitrate issues, and prussic acid or hydrocyanide acid is higher in the young growth, drought stress plants, frosted plants, regrowth, or herbicide wilted plants. We can also have nitrate issues. So if we've applied a good bit of nitrogen to the pasture and then we get drought stress, then those areas where we've got Johnson grass may have a nitrate issue. So the prussic acid is very toxic. And like I said, I've noticed some disasters. I had a case years ago in our county, and I think it was 10 or 12 head that died at one time. And it was a drouthy situation, and the producer moved the cattle to another pasture, and that pasture was also pretty stressed, and about the only thing that was growing well was some Johnson grass that was near a creek area, and that Johnson grass was either young growth or drought stressed or both, and cattle died in mass that day. So it's not a common problem, it's not an often time problem, but when it is, it can be really severe. But like I said, I've got producers that have had it in pastures for years and have never had a problem and like grazing it. So one method of control would be to mow. Johnson grass is a perennial, and to get rid of it, you have to keep it from putting out more seed, so don't let it get to the seed stage, and you have to mow those spots enough that you're going to starve out the roots, and that would be a lot of mowing. So it's not an easy method, but if you've got a small part of your field, that might be an option. The other options would be some herbicide methods. And for years, people would say, how do I get rid of this grass in my grass pasture? And the answer was, well, you can't really get rid of a grass in a grass. But now we do have some options. They may be a little bit hard on your pasture grass, but they are some options that we have. And probably the main one that we look at is Outrider, and it can be used in Bermuda grass, native grass, or fescue. Pasture can be used in Bermuda grass, and Panoramic can be used in Bermuda grass or native grass. Another option would be to use glyphosate, and you can use that as a weed wiper treatment or just a spot treatment, and you kill out everything there. Or if you've got a whole field of it, you kill out everything and then start over again and reseed the pasture. And it's not going to take just one treatment of glyphosate to get rid of it, but it'll be several times. So a little bit more details on the Outrider, and this gives us an option in fescue pastures of something that we can use, and I have used it on my own little acreage, and it does work well. It is most effective before the Johnson grass gets to the seed head stage. So be sure and check on the label what stage of growth you want to apply that. It can be hard on the fescue and the other cool season grasses, so when you look at the label, it's going to talk about using a lower rate for fescue fields. And if you went too high on that rate, you will get some yellowing or stunting on the fescue. It is not a cheap option, so I usually tell people look at trying to spot spray where you have it, and then you're not stressing the rest of your fescue pastures, and then you're saving some money. For the product alone, you're probably looking at around $15 to $20 an acre, and that's not including the surfactant and then the application cost. So it's not a cheap option, but if you want to get rid of the Johnson grass, it is one of the options we now have. There's not a grazing restriction, but because it does wilt the plants down and you want the chemical to get down into the roots, it is recommended not to mow or graze it for 2 weeks before or after the application. Let's let Dr. Evans go if he has anything on the toxic issues.
I think the simplest way that I look at it is there's two potential toxicants, poisons that are in Johnson grass, as you've outlined, Pat. One is the cyanide, and that generally is going to be concentrating in the leaves, generally in the early growth stages or the more immature plants. And then what happens to make the problem worse is when those immature plants get stressed, either by frost, either by trampling, either by sudden heat, whatever, that potentiates the ability of those poisons to affect grazing animals, particularly ruminants. And again, what you notice is these animals oftentimes die relatively quickly. Classically, they're described as having cherry red blood. Now, as the plant matures, the stems of the plant generally accumulate nitrate. So the nitrate we generally see in more mature plants, and oftentimes when those plants are in their full maturity, we oftentimes have drought stress, which also helps accumulate the nitrate in the plants. Nitrate in the plants, cattle make that into a more toxic compound that then makes it so their hemoglobin in their blood doesn't bind oxygen. And they can die relatively quickly, or you can see depressed activity. If you stress them and make them move, they have exercise intolerance. And generally, they describe those animals as having chocolate brown blood. So that's my basic, simple way of explaining the two problems.
I think with the nitrates also, isn't there a possibility that they will abort calves?
That's another complication. I generally think that with the nitrates, rather than, in my mind, necessarily abortions, we certainly see some of these exposed cattle prematurely calve. And so we get calves that are weak and oftentimes don't survive very well.
Dr. Bailey?
I would just caution folks to say the presence of one Johnson grass plant in a 40-acre field does not elicit the need for me to move the animals as far away as possible. It's a dose-dependent response, So just keep that in mind when you're making the considerations whether to spray, whether to move your animals, and know that it's weather dependent. Under normal circumstances, there's anecdotal evidence out there to suggest that it's a preferred plant by some animals. I know the Noble Foundation put an article out a few years ago that Jamie Gundel led me to. Forage quality was high. Stocker cattle seem to graze it readily. It's more in these situations where we run into some kind of weather stress, whether that's freeze or drought stress, that we can see some issues pop up.
I would add the one thing we need to be aware of is it's when we have a lot of the plant, as he's mentioned. The other thing that producers need to be aware of because of this particular plant having potential toxicity is if you're moving animals into a new pasture, and for instance, that pasture has lots of Johnson grass, either rapidly growing and immature or that which has been more mature and drought stressed, the things I always recommend is gradual introduction, taking animals that are already fed and not necessarily hungry, gradually adapt them to that. And I would also caution individuals, and again, as Pat mentioned, the fact that you may have problems with pregnant cattle. I always recommend pregnant cattle are about the last cattle that I just throw out into a new pasture. I generally recommend, since they seem to be more sensitive to things going wrong. So I generally recommend other animals being introduced first. And again, careful observation. And again, in any situation, if you're watching your cattle and you know your cattle, hopefully you can detect some of these problems before they happen.
Is a drought considered no water for a week, month, or extreme temperatures as far as what we're considering a drought?
I would say it's a combination of factors, and it's going to be if that grass gets stressed. So if we had good soil moisture and then we don't have rain for a week, it probably wouldn't be stressed. But maybe if we were having 103-degree temperature every day, or if you had really poor rocky soils, it might get stressed in that week. So anything that would make it wilt or be stressed would be my thoughts. I don't know that there's a solid hard answer. The leaves will kind of droop and maybe curl up a little bit if it's drought stressed, but that would be pretty extreme drought stress before you get seeing much of that. It might just look a little bit droopy at first.
Would fertility rate make a difference on what you just talked about?
Yes, for the prussic acid, if you've got poor fertility and it's not growing very well, that's going to make it stressed just from that. For the nitrates, the stressing it also makes it put the nitrates in the stem and it doesn't ever move it on out to the leaves. And yes, this is another reason to wait after herbicide application. And I did find one article that talked about 2,4-D, which is not a grass herbicide, can make this more of an issue also.
Can you see either of these poisonings appear in Johnson grass when outrider is applied? When the plant is stressed and wilting, can either of these poisonings appear? I assume that would be another reason to wait after herbicide application, even though there isn't a grazing restriction.
Yes, I think that's probably one of the reasons you don't want to graze it for 2 weeks after, is because it is wilted and stressed. When the tissue is dry enough that you could bale it for hay, then usually that prussic acid should be gone by then. So I think the recommendations I usually see is after a hard freeze, or after that you would wait about a week till that tissue was dried down. As it dries down, the cells rupture and that goes off into the air. Dr. Evans.
The thing I think about, and I want to reemphasize that we're talking about the stress part. I'd like to emphasize that immature Johnson grass, and again, it's funny, if you don't like it, you call it Johnson grass, and if you do like it, you call it perennial sedan, or you call it both. But what happens is that immature growth of the plant and then the leaves has the cyanide in it. And even if it's not necessarily stressed per se, if it's just that immature, rapidly growing Johnson grass, it's going to have those compounds in it that generate cyanide. And again, as Eric said, dose makes the poison. The more it is and the more rapidly the animals consume it. If you have what I call stress when it gets to cyanide, I'm talking about nervous breakdown level stress, okay? It gets trampled. It gets frozen. It gets, when we talk about it being heat stress, it basically suddenly dies. That increases the release of the cyanide. So anytime you have very immature, rapidly growing Johnson grass or perennial sedan, it's always a good idea. And again, you need to know what's in your pastures. It's always a good idea to approach these situations cautiously. And again, Extension has lots of agronomists and lots of livestock specialists that can go out and help our producers make judicious decisions on how to work with these types of situations.
It might be worth mentioning that if you are haying Johnson grass, you do not have to worry about prussic acid. It will volatilize out of the plant if it's cut for hay.
Yeah, thank you. And again, I have a tendency to recommend, again, also by the time you generally go ahead and turn Johnson grass into hay, it's generally in the more mature stages, and nitrate's going to be a bigger concern. But if you're concerned, it just depends on the circumstances. We've had times where we had some mature Johnson grass and also immature regrowth of Johnson grass at the same time. And so you've got both concerns. I'm generally pretty cautious. I generally recommend once you have a freeze, a frost, a trampling, or whatever, haying, I generally recommend about a 2-week period of time, because the amount of time it takes for that to gas off is going to vary based on a number of environmental conditions. The other thing to be aware of is that there are ways to go ahead and test the Johnson grass that you have, to test it for its cyanogenic potential and to test it for the nitrate content. So there are management methods that can be incorporated into being able to use this as a useful forage for cattle.